Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about Hamlet, Act 5. Before we talk about any of the major issues, I think it's a good idea to talk about the plot of Act 5. So let's recap that plot. Act 5 starts off with two grave diggers or clowns discussing the nature of Ophelia's death as they dig her grave. And after a little while, Hamlet, who has recently arrived back in Denmark from exile, and Horatio join the gravediggers and discuss death and the grave. And as a side note, Hamlet is often portrayed as hiding in the graveyard among the tombstones at this point in the play. Remember, he's just got back from exile. He hasn't seen the king yet, and while he has sent a letter to the king, he hasn't actually gone to the court. He's still in hiding. Anyway, Hamlet and Horatio observe the funeral procession, and Hamlet is shocked to discover that this is Ophelia's funeral. He is stirred to what we might describe as a heightened emotional state by this news. And at the end of the funeral, we find Laertes horrified that Ophelia is receiving less than the full set of funeral rites, that the priest says that she is getting more than she should have got because of the nature of her death. I'll talk about that a bit just now. And after this, Laertes, once he expresses his grief at his sister's death, and Hamlet, who has been stirred up by the news of his love interest's death, leaps into the grave in response to Laertes' show of grief for Ophelia. And once the funeral party leaves, and Hamlet tells Horatio all about his exploits at sea, as well as the fate of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who have been sent to their deaths, he also expresses his latest thoughts about his revenge. Just to summarize what those things are very briefly, it's this. Hamlet is sent to England to be killed, although he does not know it. During the course of his journey, he searches through Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's luggage, comes across the letter, discovers he is being sent to his death, forges a new letter which condemns Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to their deaths, seals it with his father's signet ring that he happens to have with him, which contains the exact Danish seal, or the royal seal of Denmark. His ship is then attacked by pirates. Hamlet, being Hamlet, leaps across to the other ship and attacks the pirates single-handedly. His ship sails away into the distance, and Hamlet then manages to persuade the pirates to deliver him safe and sound to Denmark for a small fee. He gets to Denmark changed, and here we are. At the beginning of scene 2 of Act 5, Hamlet is challenged to a duel by Laertes, and he accepts despite the misgivings that he has. He is concerned about what is going to come about from this, but he goes with it. During the duel, after the duel, the Queen, Hamlet, Laertes, and the King all meet their deaths, and that brings the death toll to those four, plus Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Ophelia, and Polonius. So we have 8 characters dying. Pretty much at this stage, the only 2 characters left alive are Fortinbras and Horatio. There are 1 or 2 other minor characters, but those are the only 2 main characters left, if you can call Fortinbras a main character even. Anyway, during Hamlet's final moments alive, he nominates Fortinbras to be the next king. Fortinbras arrives shortly after Hamlet's death after a successful Polish campaign, and he arrives at the Danish court to thank the king for the military access he has been granted and to tell them what happened. And instead, he is confronted with the scene of carnage, really. And he hears the story from Horatio and decides, as a result, to throw his proverbial hat into the ring, as it were. And before the end, Fortinbras praises Hamlet and says that Hamlet would have been a worthy king. So that is our recap of the plot. Let's talk about some of the major issues in this play, or in Act 5 of this play. We're going to start off with the graveyards, the scene in the graveyard. And we'll start off by talking about Ophelia's death, and then death itself, because both of these things are important. Now, one of the things people always speculate about is whether or not Ophelia killed herself. The short answer is we actually can't know. We can't say for sure what happened um, because the incident is only described for us in a second or third hand account. The Queen comes to everybody else and says Ophelia is dead. This is how she died. And that's all the information we are given from the noble woman, from the former queen. Well, actually, she is the queen. That is all the information we are given from the queen. It's not a lot to go on. However, it is obvious that in the court of popular opinion, as we see in the graveyard, with the grave diggers and the priest, that they think Ophelia killed herself. Most people, it seems, in the background or on the periphery of this play, think Ophelia killed herself. And this is important because the theology of the play is largely Roman Catholic, and for the Catholics, suicide is a mortal sin. Catholics they still believe, that someone who commits suicide or self-slaughter, as Hamlet refers to it, cannot be given a Christian burial and should not be given the full funeral rites. And so the fact that Ophelia is given a sort of semi-Christian burial or any sort of Christian burial shows the influence that the elites have. And this is something that both the grave diggers and the priest as well complain about. You can see this in the following two quotes. First of all, we have the grave diggers saying, one of the grave diggers at least saying, will you have the truth of it? If this had not been a gentlewoman, she should have been buried out of Christian burial. Then we have the priest saying, her obsequies have been as far and large as we have warranty. Her death was doubtful. But that great command oversways the order. She should in ground unsanctified have lodged to the last trumpet. It's fairly obvious that for both the priest and for the two grave diggers, she killed herself and she is being treated differently because of her station, because of her status. And this is something that people in societies have observed for thousands of years. Whether you are happy about this or not, whether it's just or not is immaterial. It is what happens. There tends to be two sets of rules. The rules for the overwhelming majority of people, and then the separate set of rules that exist for the rich, the powerful, the elite. And the same is true today. And that's something that Shakespeare observes for us 400 years ago. This is the nature of life. And so in Ophelia's death, we see the difference, temporally speaking, or between the elites and the common man. But before this funeral actually takes place, we have Hamlet discussing something which seems on the surface to be contradictory, but when you think about it, it really isn't. Hamlet discusses the grave and death with the gravedigger and Horatio. He is confronted, not for the first time, with death. Instead of being repulsed, he is morbidly fascinated with the idea of death. Because death is the same for everyone. It's the great equalizer. It's something we all have to face. It's something that none can escape. Whether you are a pauper or whether you are a king, you have to face your own mortality at some stage. And that is something that the world is facing at the moment with the coronavirus. You can see in the way that governments and nations have shut down and how people are terrified that, largely speaking, death is something that holds a great amount of fear for people, and people are being forced to confront their own mortality. But for Hamlet, it is the inevitability and the finitude of death that captures his imagination. We are all, as it were, infected with a fatal disease called life. And Hamlet recognizes this, and he points out that both Alexander the Great and a peasant meet the same fate. They end up dust and return to the earth. And therefore, death is the great equalizer, because none can escape it, and because none can escape the judgment that comes with it. And this is the picture that is portrayed for us. On the one hand, we have even Ophelia in her funeral being treated differently because she's part of the elite. But on the other hand, she is dying in the same, or she has died in the same way that everybody must die, and she is joined with everybody in the same thing. And so even though up to the point of death and afterwards in the case of funerals, the elite can be treated differently, it makes no difference to what actually happens to them. But there's a kind of cruel irony here beyond that. Hamlet has been contemplating death with a sort of morbid fascination, a kind of philosophical detachment. But now he's confronted with the death of his beloved Ophelia. Hamlet's words and actions in leaping into the grave and declaring that 40,000 brothers could not love Ophelia as he did betrays his true feelings. He does love her. He always has loved her. And now she's gone. And so we can see that it's very easy for Hamlet on the one hand to talk about death and contemplate it on a philosophical level. It's a very different thing when you yourself are confronted with the death of a loved one. And that is something that Hamlet has to face here. And so he is greatly moved and again experiences deep-seated grief because of the death of Ophelia. But enough about that. Enough about death. Hamlet is going to die. Ophelia has died. Hamlet isn't dead yet and the play isn't done yet. And one thing that we have to talk about, because it is very noticeable in the play, is the change in Hamlet's character between Hamlet before his adventures at sea and Hamlet after his adventures at sea. And this change is so noticeable that very often Hamlet is given a wardrobe change between after his adventures at sea, to symbolize the change that he has had at a fundamental level. Gone is the desperate Hamlet who rants and raves about revenge, the evil of the world, his father, his uncle, and everything in between. Here is the new Hamlet, who has had some time and space away from Denmark, away from Elsinore, away from the court and the people plotting his demise. Here he is with a clearer mind. He has come to terms with the evil of his uncle and the corruption of the state. He has come to terms with the situation in which he has found himself. He recognizes that something has to be done about his uncle, but he is content to let be and entrust his course to Providence, rough hew them as he, Hamlet, will. Hamlet recognizes his smallness and has a sort of religious awakening. And we can see this in two quotes. First is this one. Hamlet says, "There is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will." Because of Hamlet's experience on the pirate ship, where some ridiculous coincidence takes place, or he recognizes that there is a divinity that shapes his end. This is a very Christian idea. It was prevalent today, but also in Hamlet's time. Hamlet recognizes that on one hand, there is a divinity that shapes our end. There is a God who is in control of what happens in the world. On the other hand, he recognizes that we ourselves have our own part to play. We make our own decisions. We are active players on the stage we call life. But we are human, we are not divine, and so we rough hew the divinity, or the ends that the divinity shapes. And so the idea here is Hamlet is encapsulating the Christian belief that there is a divine providence that shapes the ends of the world, and also at the same time we have our own part to play on the stage. The second thing that we see Hamlet saying is this: "Not a whit we defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it not be to come, it will be now." This is Hamlet talking about his misgivings about the duel. He is concerned about what is going to come out of it, but he goes along with it. Why? Well, it's quite simply because Hamlet's character is changed. He is no longer railing against the system, as it were. He has recognized in himself that God is in control of the events of the world, and he's prepared to go along with that and trust in providence. Providence, for those of you who do not know, it's not really used that much anymore, but it was particularly used to refer to God's control and provision for his creation, control over and provision for his creation. And so what we see in Hamlet is a sort of religious awakening as he recognizes his smallness and the small part that he plays in the grand scheme of things. And because of that, he has a greater peace of mind and a greater ability to act and take action, a greater ability to look at things from a more detached perspective and think about them clearly and more rationally. Having said that, let's move on to the last thing that we need to talk about in this play, and that is Fortinbras. At the end of the play, once Hamlet and everybody else has died, Fortinbras arrives on the scene and is filled in on the details. And do be forgiven for wondering what this has to do with anything. Fortinbras is, after all, a peripheral figure at best, and that's reflected in the fact that he is often removed from film and stage adaptations, and in the fact that for many editions of Hamlet, the scenes that feature Fortinbras are largely taken out. But I think that's a mistake. It's a mistake to write Fortinbras out of the play. Why? Well, first, Fortinbras forms a pair with Hamlet. Both he and Hamlet lost a father and had an uncle take the throne from them. Both are set on revenge, and both pursue the course of revenge, although it must be said, Fortinbras seems to be more committed to that at the beginning, because he raises an entire army to take his revenge. However, there is a subtle difference for Fortinbras. He doesn't have a crook for an uncle, as far as we can see, for one thing. And two, most importantly, the difference between Hamlet and Fortinbras is that Fortinbras abandons his course of revenge. And that's important because revenge is a cursed task. And that's why at the end of the play, Hamlet dies while Fortinbras survives. And that's also why Fortinbras is worthy to take the Danish throne and clean up the corruption of the state of Denmark. And that brings me on to the second thing that makes Fortinbras an important figure thematically. And that's this. Fortinbras is important because he is the external figure who comes to purge and renew the state of Denmark. The royal family and the court of Denmark are too corrupted to be saved from within. It needs saving, but that salvation has to come from the outside, and Fortinbras is that person. Not only has he not succumbed to revenge, but he is also from outside the court, while still being distantly related to the royal family so that he has a legitimate claim. But he comes from outside and has overcome the revenge that Hamlet had to take. And so only Fortinbras can take it. Now you might say that that's a bit unfair because Hamlet really has to do something at the end, even morally speaking. He is confronted by his uncle, the king, who has done several dastardly acts. And so you can say that he gets his just desserts. But unfortunately, what happens with revenge is that the person who takes revenge is always corrupted by this task. And that is true for Hamlet as well. And that's what makes this play a tragedy. Because as we come to the end of this play, Hamlet, our great character, dies. He has to die. He can't survive. He dies with his honor and reputation intact, if somewhat diminished. And even if it's not diminished, he dies. And that's the end of the road for him. He cannot play his part anymore on the stage of life. And while he is carried off like a soldier, being honored by Fortinbras, carried off by 4 soldiers, he is still dead. He is gone. Ophelia is gone. His mother is gone. And his former friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, are gone. Polonius is dead. The king has died. It's a tragic, bloody end to this examination of evil, politics, and human nature in general. That's my review for you of Act 5 of Hamlet. I am going to be putting out another video which deals with the play more broadly in the next day or so, so keep an eye out for that.